One of the easiest types of joinery to add to bent lamination is either a half lap, a bridle joint, or a tenon, because all those really require is a little bit of reference face, and we can artificially recreate reference face by creating platforms for things like routers to ride on, or even for your laminations to ride on over machines to recreate that reference face. So right now I'm gonna kind of make a more versatile version of this particular jig. I kind of whipped up this particular jig while I was in the shop on the go, so I wasn't really thinking of making it particularly versatile. It was just for one particular thickness of lamination, which was this thickness lamination. So I made these two walls to hug the lamination on either side, and then I made a platform out of I believe this is called hardboard, 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch hardboard. And all I did was I cut two, using the same material, the same sheet good material, preferably a pretty thin material. I cut two outer wings for the router to ride on. So the ones on this particular jig were about 2 inches wide by like 6 inches long. And then I cut a strip of the same material, same length, so still 6 inches. And then I just cut that in half and glued up my platform. So it basically looks like a solid rectangle with a rectangular hole cut through it. And it's just a really fast and easy way on the table saw to create a platform for your router to ride on. Without having to overthink the jig too much. So this particular jig, again, was made for this width of lamination, so that when I insert the lamination, the two walls of the jig hug the piece snugly. And then I could either do half laps on one side of my lamination by having the concave side up, resting on the outer wings of my router platform, or I could do half laps from the other side, again by kind of pressure fitting my lamination in there and having it rest on the inner wings of my on the two sides of my router platform. So I did have to change the depth setting for my router when I switched between either the concave or the convex side of my lamination. But it was a very fast way for me to quickly cut half laps accurately and perpendicular to my curve. The main thing that I found with this particular jig was that it was very difficult to like perfectly nail the width of my cut. So what I ended up doing was I would cut my shoulders. I would pare those by hand with the chisel after I had already taken the bulk of the waste out with my router. So I'm going to create a slightly more versatile version of this jig today. So I have the two wings that my router will run on, and then inside is the piece that determines the width of my cut. And it doesn't need to be terribly precise because I could always put a bushing on my router setup and adjust the width of my cut that way as well. So I'm going to go for a bigger size, assuming that I could always make it a narrower cut using a router bushing. So instead of 1.25 inches, I'm doing 1.5 inches. And then I'm also going to be creating, again, this wall, this sort of MDF rib for the lamination to be clamped onto, but I'm not going to make it double-sided this time because I want to be able to use it for multiple laminations and not have to make a new jig for every single width of laminate that I have. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by cutting my inner spacer in half, and then I'm going to glue up my router platform with that spacer in between, holding the two wings apart from each other like this. Okay, so I've glued up the plate for my router to run on for either like a half lap or tenoning or half dovetail half flap dovetail joinery jig. And you can see I just applied really light pressure with some quick grips. I didn't want so much pressure that I risked getting these pieces out of planar with each other. I have my 2 jigs out of their glue up. Because I want the sides of this jig to be equidistant to the interior opening, the rectangular opening, I'm actually going to be using the interior as my stop for the cut. So you can see I just double sticked a little offcut of bent lam here. And all I'm doing is pushing it home to this stop right here. And that should cut all of my jigs equally, so that they'll all be the same size and so that they'll be equidistant. I went and I cut little dado grooves in the bottom of my, for the lack of a better word, router plate jig. And for those of you who have made a jig for cutting sliding dovetail or even just like mortise joinery across a big slab, you'll notice there's a lot of similarities in the basic structure of this piece. The only primary difference is that these are much smaller because they're made just to sort of like interact tangentially with a small curve. It's not meant for a giant slab. But just like those jigs, you could go a lot more into the engineering of this piece, and you could make something that be infinitely adjustable for a variety of different curves and laminations and thicknesses and widths. I made this really simple because I tend to work within very similar dimensions all the time. So you can see this one, my dado is running crosswise to the length of that interior hole, and I can clamp my lamination onto my little fence that I've dadoed in there on either side. And cut a half flap. I could cut a sliding dovetail. I could cut a perpendicular mortise. I could really repurpose this for a variety of different jigs. And you'll see on the bottom here, because my fence or my dadoed little piece of wood in there is inside the interior rectilinear hole, I did go and cut away some of that rib there, just so that my router will be able to pass, and that way I will be able to make cuts all the way to the edge of my lamination. So that's the entire reason why I did that, was so that I could cut into the edge of my lamination. This router jig is made more in the mind of a tenon that's running parallel with the grain of my lamination, which is why I have a parallel fence. And this one is a little bit less versatile in that if I really wanted to center my mortise, I'd have to do some thinking about the type of bushing I'm going to use and the placement of this fence here. So this one could really benefit from having more adjustability, but for me, adjustability also leads to mistakes more often because you leave that margin of error for yourself. So I have this one fixed, but I'll probably attach the fence with screws so that I can continue to adjust this jig in the future. Hope this makes sense. I think once you guys are actually using these jigs, it will make more sense to you. But basically all I've done is just create a miniaturized version of the cross-cut router jig that you may have made on a slab in intro.